Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We'll make a start. So firstly, I'd like to welcome you to the National Tillage Conference 2024, and thank you all for coming. Firstly, I need to pass on our director's apologies. He couldn't be here this morning. He's overseas on business and he's in New Zealand, so it was a bit of a trek to come back to be with us today. But if he was around, he would certainly have been here. So the morning session is as normal for the Tillage Conference. There'll be a series of short presentations and then time at the end with panel discussions for you to ask questions. You can either do those from within the room, by putting your hand up, or you can scan the QR code on the screen here, which will take you to Slido, and you can put questions on there which will be put to the panel. And also on that link is the feedback questionnaire for you to fill in at the end of the day. And please do fill that in. We do alter the Tillage Conference format and contents according to the feedback we get. And on that note, this afternoon we have workshop sessions. You should be booked into 3 of the 5 workshop sessions. So the 3 rooms down this corridor will be separated up with a separate workshop in each one. They're colour-coded, and on your badge you should have 3 coloured stickers. And to work out which one you go to, you go from left to right and just go into that coloured room for that workshop, and there'll be people around to direct you after lunch to the correct place. Okay, there's also, we're trying an online proceedings this year, so there's a QR code also on your badge that you can scan with your phone, which will take you to each of the presentations, and obviously that will be there not just today but in the future if you want to refer back to it. And if you can't manage the scanning with your phone to get to the links, please ask someone younger than me. And there's plenty of young people in the audience, which is also great to see. Either the audience is getting younger or I'm getting older, but seeing plenty of young people around the room is certainly, I think, a positive thing for the tillage sector. There's no closing, obviously, this evening, because we'll be finishing with the workshops and there'll be tea and coffee for you after that. So hopefully you'll all stay for all of the workshops in the afternoon. But because there's no closing, I just want to take this opportunity to thank a few people, particularly Ewan, the researchers, the technicians and the farm staff in Oak Park, without whom there's a huge amount of organisation goes into this, but without them all we wouldn't have anything to talk to you about either, without having done all the research over the years. And also obviously the tillage specialists and the tillage advisors who are a core part of that in terms of discussing the research that we do. I particularly want to thank Eleanor and the admin team in Oak Park, Cheryl, Mary and Sharon. They put a huge amount of effort into preparing this and doing badges and all the rest of it, and they were certainly there very late last night getting everything ready, so a particular thanks to those. And I think that's it, and I was told to be quick, so I'm going to end in a second, and I guess we can't start today without thinking about last year. I think it was probably the worst year I can remember, certainly in terms of harvest and conditions for planting, and having followed what was probably one of the best years ever in 2022. But look, it's history now, and today and the rest of the day we're really thinking about the future. We're thinking about this year, what we can do for the rest of this year, but also it's in the workshops in the afternoon looking at the Tillage Food Vision Group and various other things, what we can do further out into the future to help develop and bring the Irish tillage sector forward. So look, just hoping you all have a very useful and productive day, and I'll hand over to Siobhan, who's chairing the first session. Thank you.
Thanks, John, and good morning, everyone. It's great to see such a good crowd here, and look, I hope you use the day to chat to plenty of people and, of course, take in the research and information. As John said, it has been a tough year in 2023, and indeed the end of 2022 before it. So in light of that, this session is hopefully going to help a lot of people make decisions. No doubt a lot of you are looking at crops that weren't planted or poorly emerged crops. So in this session, Michael Hennessy, who's going to join us up on stage now, will tell us, he's going to paint us a picture with that survey that Teagasc carried out over the last few weeks, which many of you took part in. And I know Michael has a few videos then with farmers Tom Short and Tom Nolan, and advisors Owen Lyons and Patrick Power. And then after that, Shay Phelan then. So when we've heard of the problems, Shay Phelan is going to solve some of them, talking about plant counts and management decisions. And then we have Dermot Forristal talking on rotations and the importance of maintaining them. And at the end then, we will have a panel discussion with Shay, Dermot, Tom and Tim O'Donovan from the Irish Seed Trade Association. So I'd encourage you to get your questions in on Slido, as John said. Download the app and the code is NTC. So Michael, we're eagerly awaiting your results.
Great, thanks very much, Siobhan. Yep, so look, I'm going to try and paint a picture just in a preview of what's going to come afterwards. So it'll give us a good idea about the challenges, I suppose, that are out there and stuff that we see, I suppose, out there online. So what we did was we, hopefully most people in here probably filled in this survey. We conducted a survey over SurveyMonkey around late December, early January. We had a good lot of respondents. That's a big number for anything you do in terms of a survey. Not everybody completed it the whole way through, and we had, in terms of usable data, about 414 farmers. So it's pretty good data, I suppose, from that point of view. So what do we see? So when we look at the systems and to see whether the people who actually responded are fairly well representative of who's out there, I think it probably is. Plough-based dominates with the majority of people out there, and then mixed between total min-till people and people with a mix of min-till and plough, of which are probably a higher proportion, and we'll come to that a little bit later on, maybe even a little bit more in the year that was in it. And we had a few direct drill or zero-till people in it, so you just might remember that group are actually quite small. They might represent, they might seem bigger figures at the end, but they're actually a small group of farmers who responded to the survey. So in terms of all of that, it represents the guts of, or certainly our respondents said it represents the guts of 30,000 hectares of cereal ground out there. So it's a fairly big cohort of people that are in the survey. So in terms of the establishment systems, how did they get on in terms of the target area that they wanted to plant? How much did they get planted? I suppose on average is about 62% overall, which I think lots of people, you're thinking to yourself, God, is that higher or lower than where I am? And there's, I suppose, some interesting things. As I said, the zero-till or direct drill guys, they tended to, or the people who responded, they have more in. That's maybe not unsurprising, because they're probably going at it that little bit earlier. And the guys in min-till probably got that little bit caught, I suppose. The weather did turn pretty poor very quickly. And maybe there's lots of guys out there who had a mix of systems, probably maybe got on a little bit better. Probably a bit more interesting that the plough-based guys are a little bit behind, I suppose, in that sense. Not really sure why that is, but look, we'll have a look at it as we go. So in terms of just looking at the various different areas, was there any area that was worse or better than anybody else? And you can see across the line there, if you draw the average 62%, the likes of, you would have thought, I suppose, that around kind of Kilkenny, Wexford might have been that little bit better maybe. But there's a couple of videos we're going to show you in a second will give you an indication of maybe why that is. They've probably got more weather down towards the Wexford direction. Certainly around here, up around kind of Oak Park direction, Carlow, Kildare, Laois, probably got on reasonably well, lighter ground, able to get in when they wanted to get it in. But obviously the heavier ground up around kind of Dublin, Meath, Louth, they struggled as well to get as much in as they wanted to get in. So how representative is that in a general sense? So if we were to look at the average winter cereal planting from 21 to 23, it's around 130,000 hectares, okay? And that's based on winter barley, winter wheat and winter oats. So if we were to look at the estimates that we had and everybody we talked to in the industry had in terms of seed sales, but also what's visibly planted out there, because just because you sell seed doesn't mean it's actually planted. And the area we had, I suppose, come up with was somewhere around 78,000 hectares. And again, if we look at that average area from over the various different years, 130,000 hectares, we reckon, or the survey brings back about 62%, so it's about 80,000 hectares is what the survey is representing, or what the survey says, if you like, is out there. So we reckon it's actually a really representative sample of what's out there. So I think that's a good one. But we'll hear now from a video, one of our farmers that we hooked up with a number of weeks ago to see how he got on. Okay.
Tom Short, Kilmullen, Newtown and Kennedy, East Wicklow. So there was a lot of records broken. Month of March, month of October, rainfall records. And I think the East Coast would have got an overburdened share of it. We would have only sown about 45% of what our planned sowing were.
this year we're only maybe at 50% of the crops that would have been due to go in. And it's a real shame because we had a lot of break crops sown in 2023, so we had a natural kind of progression. Potentially a good bit of wheat has gone in after these break crops, but the like of your barleys and your oats, they haven't been sown. This year, given that constant rain that was falling, a lot of them mint hill farmers have gone back to plough-based systems because it just was so hard to try and get that mint hill fields to dry out enough in order to drill. So we've seen a lot more plough crops go in this year, switching away from mint hill. But in no doubt, I know people will go back to mint hill again next autumn if conditions allow. You know, I think land is so wet at the moment that we're going to need excellent drying in order to dry out that conditions. But there might be some people, maybe if they have winter wheat seed in stock, that they might go with maybe sow wheat in February, but I think it's going to be a very small proportion of the farmers in the area.
We would run a rotation with 7 different crops, and winter wheat being our prime aim always. It's the most viable. Would have moved away from plough-based system maybe 10 years ago into minimum tillage, and simply to speed up the operation and to get through the work faster. Then we went on into September, October. It just was snap and grab all the time. October came when we should have been ploughing, and we should have been re-sowing. We used mainly a minimum tillage operation, but this year we found ourselves that the only hope we had was to try and plough the ground and let the top of it dry and then sow it. We would have only sown about 45% of what our planned sowing were. All we can do is dust ourselves down, pick it up and try and maintain and get our rotation back in. It's going to put massive pressure on the spring, and it's also going to, we don't have the proper crop rotation. We have to be very, very careful. We could find ourselves with too much spring barley or too much spring beans. It will have a knock-on effect for the next number of years. When you have a lot of acres to get through, you have to have, you spread the risk, because you can't be you can't harvest them all at the one time. So our harvest would start end of July, wouldn't finish until maybe 10th of September of our normal year. Do we sow spring wheat? Do we sow spring barley? There's a huge amount of decisions we have to make, and we're making them at the minute. But in reality, spring barley and spring beans are probably going to be the 2 big crops of the spring.
I think the biggest advice I can give to farmers in the area for 2024, okay, we're coming off, as I mentioned, we're coming off an autumn where we only have 50% of our crops drilled. If we get a good spring, there's a big opportunity there to get more break crops in the ground. And really, we're going to look at beans as being a big part of that. But we still need to get that range of crops in the ground, because we can see from profit analysis on tillage farms that the bigger the range of crops we have, the more break crops, the better chance we can get first wheats growing. It's always going to improve profitability.
We're standing here now in a field of winter wheat that was sown after spring beans. We got 5 inches of rain within a fortnight of this being sown, and it just sealed the top of the ground, and it caused terrible problems. You'll see parts of this field where there just isn't enough plants. Are we going to have to come back in and re-sow some of it? Those are decisions. Can't really make those maybe for another couple of weeks, but the likes of this area we're standing now, there is no wheat left here. Do we come back in? It's a relatively small area. It's probably 5-8% of the total. It's not going to be acceptable to our department. There's no crop in it, so this can't be left. I think it's a shame that we will have to come back in and try and stitch in, because it's not going to be viable. You put spring barley in here, and they're relatively small patches. You're doing more damage to the existing crop trying to stitch it in. But I would suggest that we would get a system where we can put in a cover crop here, a green cover crop, and let nature look after and let this soil recover for the next 12 months.
Certainly, I think that a lot of the messages there that Tom has and his experiences are fairly well mirrored, I think, in terms of your own experience maybe out there on the ground. And just to look a little bit further, Tom mentioned he's running quite a large farm. He's lots of crops in it, and it was just interesting to have a look at there might have been the expectation from lots of people to think that, well, the larger farmers must be under more pressure than everybody else, and probably they got less in than everybody else. And that really is not the case in terms of what they're reporting from our survey. Larger farms have every bit as much in as everybody else. Surprisingly, the smaller ones have, but that's maybe just it's a nuance maybe in terms of it's a relatively large category from 0 to 40 hectares. But there's not really a lot of difference between the amount planted and farm size. However, there might be something maybe in it in terms of the flexibility when establishing the crop system. So we asked people what sort of system they had, whether it was a plough-based, a mix of plough or min-till, or was it min-till-based. And when we look across the lines there in the various different regions, we can see that a number of the areas, the mix of plough and min-till is slightly ahead of the plough in certain areas and the min-till as well. Maybe not unsurprising, Tom mentioned it already there, that he had to turn to the plough away from min-till that he would done that he might have done in the past. So there's maybe a little bit in that. But maybe there's a little bit more to that system. You know, in terms of that flexibility, when we start to look and dig into it, when we ask those people, you know, how much of that crop that you have sown do you think you might need to re-sow? And the guys with the flexible system, I suppose, or with a mix of ploughing and min-till, look like they have a little bit more reporting they might need to replant a little bit more. So were they continuing to plant maybe a little bit further than maybe they should have done? Were the conditions maybe not as good? And maybe in fairness to them, as we'll hear in a minute, there was an awful amount of rain on an awful lot of those crops well after they were planted. They might have been planted in reasonable conditions, but afterwards it mightn't have been as good as you would like to try and get the crops up. So we also asked then in terms of, you know, for the area of winter crops that were planted, what are you going to plant in that ground? So what are you going to replace that with? So you can see across the line there, spring barley is by far and away the one that people are kind of recognising that that's the one they're really going to fill the gap. But there is, I suppose, a relatively even split between winter wheat, beans and peas and spring oats that are going to plant some extra of those. But I suppose the other one there, and we will be talking about it in a session in the afternoon, not a lot of love for forage crops out there, maybe for good reason, I don't know, but certainly not a lot of people are talking about growing a lot of those there. But, you know, everyone needs to plan at the time, and we'll hear now from another farmer down further on the southeast to see how he's getting on.
Hello, I'm Tom Nolan. We're just outside the village of Tom Nolan in County Wexford. We're tillage farmers. We have probably only about 30% of what we'd normally sow as winter cropping. We just couldn't sow it due to land got too wet and weather didn't allow it.
In the southeast, normally we wouldn't see near as much rainfall as other parts of the country. This year just has been the opposite of that. We have had 4 months in a row of extremely wet weather, which has really hampered land work that would not normally be the case at all in this region. At the start of September, there was a fine break in the weather and some people got some oilseed rape sown. It was too early at that point to sow cereals, so it didn't materialise at all. But as we moved on, towards the end of September and into the start of October, there was a couple of very small windows to get some corn sown. And if you look at the field we're standing at the moment, it's very typical of how it was sown that time. People did get back to sow some corn, whether it be winter barley or a small bit of winter wheat, towards the end of November. But areas were very small and a lot of people on any heavier clay ground didn't get to sow anything at all. So it is having a huge knock-on effect on the area of winter cereal in this region. So people who would have traditionally min-tilled and had been doing that for a number of years had to go away from it this year and go back to plough-based systems to try and get some form of cereals in the ground, but even at that a lot of people struggled as well.
A mix of cereal crops with winter wheat, winter barley, winter oats, oilseed rape. We grow spring beans and our main crop will be spring malt and barley. We're a plough-based system. We have a one pass and we also have a trail drill, so either or, but we have used min-till at times when conditions allow as well. We have probably only about 30% of what we'd normally sow as winter cropping. We just couldn't sow it due to land got too wet and weather didn't allow it. We sowed this crop of winter barley the 10th of October. We sowed in only very average conditions. As you can see, we've very patchy emergence and we got up to 10 inches of rain within a month after it being sowed, and the springs opened in the field and we ended up with a very patchy crop. At the moment we are considering reseeding or to leave the crop as it is, but to fertilise, put chemical on, the missing part is the problem. And we're going to decide now in the next month, is it worth going with fertilisers and that in the spring, or will we just have to tear it up and sow back spring barley or a crop like that?
I suppose the decisions the farmers have to make and the advice that's going to be given is don't do anything rash. Assess your crops. Places that look like they may need to be resown may not, or the areas gone may be so small that they wouldn't warrant resowing anyway. So don't make any rash decisions.
We're going to have to change our crop, and maybe spring beans, we have to look at spring oats, maybe extra spring barley, but we're just going to have to change our crop and rotation to facilitate the 3-crop rule now as we stand. Normally winter wheat that we only sow first wheats, we don't go for second wheats or continuous wheats, so we depend on our break crop. And with no oilseed rape sowed, we're going to have a big hole next year to get the crop rotation back for winter wheat. So next year is going to be our problem to have land for winter wheat, is where it's going to affect our rotation going forward.
So a huge thanks to certainly both farmers there. I mean, it's not easy. It's a very honest appraisal of their farming system, and you know, a massive thanks for them to actually putting their hand up and actually doing it for us. So as Tom was saying there, there's plenty of decisions to be made there on all farms out there, and I suppose, so what's the seed situation look like? Because it isn't wonderful. So if we do the calculations based on what we know that's out there and based on the survey, we know that there's the guts of 80,000 hectares of winter cereals sown, but some might need to be replanted, as we showed there in that video a second ago. There's about 15,000 hectares of oilseed rape that's in the ground. A few of them are, I know, going to come out again because slugs were a massive issue this year as well. About 2,000 hectares of rye. Again, there's some slug issues, but most of those should be okay, I think. In terms of spring wheat, we're counting there's going to be an awful lot more spring wheat than normal of seed in the system that we're counting on. Plus, we're hoping that there's going to be a good bit more winter wheat going back in that maybe is in sheds, and we're really encouraging people to sow some of those winter varieties in, so we're counting on about 3,200 hectares of that. There's about 15,000 hectares of beans out there. That's all the seed that's available, other than potentially home-saved seed. There's about 20,000 hectares of spring oats out there. In terms of seed that's available, and maybe there might be some home-saved seed there as well that we don't know. Beet is a fairly defined market, a little over 9,000 hectares. Maize we've put a little bit onto last year, around 20,000 hectares, but like I say, there's not a huge appetite for it from tillage farmers, and you know, we certainly shouldn't be growing it on spec certainly anyway, unless you're quite strong to be able to hold it for a number of years. Spring oilseed rape, there's a bit of seed in the system there that will increase maybe threefold from where it is this year. If we maintain the same amount of spring barley as last year, a little over 130,000 hectares, we know that's the seed that's there in terms of the domestic grown seed and what's been imported. We know that's pretty much all that's there, certainly at the moment at least anyways. Add all that up and compare it to the 2023 area that was sown, we're shy of about 26,000 hectares. So there's about that amount of ground that's kind of missing seed, if you like. So that's the guts of 8% of the entire tillage area. So, you know, we're on a path, or hopefully we're on a path to get towards 400,000, but it certainly doesn't look like we're going to get it based on those figures. So look, a few questions that I'm going to pose. I'm not going to answer them necessarily because that's for the next speakers on the panel as well. But you know, hopefully we get a little bit of weather over the next 2 or 3 weeks to plant in some of that winter wheat in there, and certainly get the beans planted as well. Will some home-saved seed come into play? I'm not sure. We know from some of the results coming back it's not wonderful. Can the seed industry, they've certainly seemed to be pulling out everything out of the bag to try and source seed, but it has to come from a long way. We can answer that later on as well. And maybe Tom, in the first video, asked a question about some fallows or cover crops. Could that be an attractive proposition for some farmers out there this year? So look, they're all questions. I'm going to leave it at that. Siobhan, I'll hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. And certainly look very clear that the east of the country is very badly affected, but as bad as those figures are, I think it's very important that we get the confirmation of those figures. Shay, you might make your way up on stage. And as Michael said, I think a big well done to Tom Short and Tom Nolan for painting the picture and showing the situation on on those farms, because they're similar to everyone else's farms, and hopefully the powers that be maybe will listen and look at the tree crop rule and rules around bare patches and crops. Just a reminder, get your questions in on Slido. There's no Roman mics, so if you want to get a question in, maybe ask the person beside you if you're not sure about using Slido. Shay, we'll let you away, so.
Yeah, thanks, Siobhan. Good morning, folks. I'm just basically being asked to kind of look at the scenarios that are out there and kind of maybe put a bit of figures to them and maybe see are there options out there or any options that are preferable over other crops. Tom and the other farmers and Michael and the advisors mentioned different options that people might look at, so I'm going to have a brief look at them and see what might be viable for us going forward. So I suppose that paints the picture. You've seen pictures of that all around the country this year. It feels like deja vu. We've been here like this a couple of years ago as well. And you know, we made decisions that time. Some of them worked out, some of them didn't. And I'm going to kind of have a look and see whether we should, you know, consider replanting crops, look at tiller numbers and maybe how we assess the crops. So I suppose what we look at when we're looking at our crops and over the next 3 weeks, month or whatever it is before the season really kicks off, we should really, you know, decide on our agronomy strategy for those crops based on what we see in front of us. You would have seen Pat putting down a quadrant there to try and do plant counts, and that's what we should be doing in all the areas of these fields now. Once you have those plant counts, then you decide what type of an agronomy package I'm going to bring forward on that crop. Whether it's a normal strategy based on achieving target yields or normal yields for the farm, or whether you alter that strategy and you reduce your inputs to try and give yourself a chance of making money on the crop. It's not about how well the crop looks, it's about making money on the crop. And the third option then is whether you replant or not. To give you kind of an idea of where we should be looking at, and these are the kind of figures that we would put on crops in terms of when you are doing that sort of assessment. If you're looking at winter wheat, you know, if you're north of 100, 200 plants per square metre, then that crop is probably viable to take it through to a normal harvest or normal yield, if you like. If you're between 90 and 200, it'll probably still pay you to keep that crop there, but you may have to alter the input strategy that you're going to use in that crop. And if you're below 90, depending on the area of the field, the size of the area in the field, and how good that land is or isn't, I suppose in some cases how prone it is to flooding and things like that, you may decide to replant, or as Tom said earlier on, maybe leave it idle altogether and just leave it as fallow and try and repair that area. In the case of barleys in 2 rows, if you have 250 plants or more, that we leave it there. If you're between 150 and 2, well then you decide, yeah, I'm probably going to leave that there and maybe reduce my inputs. And if you're below 150, well then chances of that being a viable crop, you know, are slim. But again, it comes down to, as I said before, the area within the field that's missing. Unfortunately, with all these things, it's not even across the field, or patches here and there and everywhere. So you have to try and decide over the whole area of the field whether it's viable to take it out or not. In the case of 6-row barleys, they do have that capacity to tiller more, so you can tolerate lower plant counts. That said, again, if you're down lower than 90 or 100 plants, you have to question if that's across the whole field, whether that's viable or not. Oats, there's probably not that much oats out there this year. I know some were planted late on, and to be fair, most of those crops look reasonably okay. Another one looks poor enough, but again, you can see the figures there. 275 plus, you're okay, stay going where you're going. If you're, you know, about 150 or somewhere around there, then certainly you need to be taking account of that and seeing what should I be doing. And likewise with the other crops, if you're below 90 plants per square metre, then you should certainly be questioning whether you keep that crop forward or not. So this is an example of some of the department work that was going on a couple of years ago. This is Gareth in 2018. It's a good indication of what's out there, and it kind of gives you a feel for what crops can actually do if the plants are evenly spaced and you give them the necessary attention. All right, so these plants here, there were plots all over the country. There was a problem with the seed that year, which kind of mimics what we're looking at the moment to a certain degree, but not exactly. But in these plants here, and these plots here, they were getting somewhere between 60 and 80 plants per square metre. And obviously they weren't going to be taken out, so those crops were taken all the way through to yield. And in that year, across all the sites that the department were working on, they averaged somewhere about 85% of the control of the rest of the plots in those trials. So it does highlight the idea that, look, you don't necessarily have to rip out everything, that the crop if given a chance, given time, can recover and can establish decent yields. So it's borderline viable, you might argue, but at the same time, is it any less viable than, or any more viable or less viable than resowing? And we'll have a look at that in a minute. So I suppose when we're talking about how do we manage these suboptimal plants, obviously we want to try and get the maximum out of it, and the temptation in a lot of cases is to start throwing fertilizer at it to try and drive that crop, okay? So we have to look and see what are the potentials of those crops. So if you have a 10 tonne per hectare crop, you can see the figures there. You're looking at 38 kilos of P and 98 kilos of K. So you fertilise to that level, and you give the crop every chance it possibly can to achieve that 10 tonnes. On the flip side, if you know a crop is, a lower potential, it doesn't have the same demand for P, or nitrogen for that matter. So you can actually take a decision there, right? We probably should, and it is the logical thing to do, we should reduce our costs and our fertiliser inputs on that, bring it down to 28 kilos of P and 74 kilos of K. That's 2.7 bags in old money versus 4 bags an acre of a compound. So that gives you a saving straight away. So you're not trying to make the crop cover that extra cost, okay? So you are actually giving the crop a better chance of actually giving you a margin at the end of it. And that's what we're all about. The other thing I suppose people are talking about is front-loading nitrogen. And I think this is something we just need to be careful about, that when you're putting on that nitrogen early in the season, there needs to be growth there. There's absolutely no point in trying to drive a crop very, very early with no growth there, because chances are you'll lose some of that nitrogen, and that's, given the climate we're in at the moment, that's not the place to be. So what I've done then is I've looked at resowing then. If we decide, right, there's nothing there, or there's not enough there for me to consider keeping that crop on, what do I do? So what I've done here is I've looked at winter wheat and winter barley as our two main crops there that, we are struggling with them at the moment. We're assessing them at the moment, and we're making decisions on them there. So if you take that, this is from the cost and returns booklets that we have out there. They're out in the foyer later on if you want to take them home with you. So these figures are based on that. So if you take winter wheat and winter barley, strangely enough, break-even yield for those, given the costs that are associated to those crops at their target sort of yields of maybe 10 or 11 tonnes per hectare, break-even yield is about 8.1 tonnes per hectare for those crops, okay? So what I've done then with the other crops all in yellow, as you can see them there, I've added in, I've put their input costs, but I've added back in the costs associated with drilling in the back end. So the cost of drilling that winter wheat, the seed cost, and the actual machinery cost of actually planting that wheat in December or in October or November, and added that onto the cost. So that new crop that you put in has to carry that cost. There's no other way about it. Has to carry that cost. And coincidentally enough here, when you look at spring wheat, spring feed barley, spring oats, they're all around 8.1 tonnes per hectare as well. So the question then you have to ask yourself, if by re-drilling that crop or that area within that crop, has it a chance of achieving that yield? And is it going to leave me a margin then? And if it has, it has, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. People have mentioned spring beans as an opportunity there. That's maybe somewhere to go. Again, you need to be careful with that. Is it going to fit in with that field's rotation? And the two farmers mentioned it earlier on. It's all about rotation as well. Is it going to fit in there? And bearing in mind some of these crops may have been sprayed already, so you have to think about, is there going to be an effect from the spray, and do I need to do something different? To me, the one crop that really stands out there, if you're lucky enough to have a contract and you're lucky enough to get it passed, is malting barley. To me, that's the crop that's most likely to give you a decent margin over the other crops. The rest of them, really it's a toss of a coin, and it really comes down to the situation within the field in terms of what's there, what do I need to plant, what's the soil like, what's the field like. So it really does there's a lot of questions to be answered before you make a decision. And I suppose, again, looking at that, and I pull that out further, so if you look at the cost of growing a 10-tonne crop versus a 7-tonne crop of winter wheat, and then I put back that as regards growing a 7.5-tonne crop of spring barley with the additional costs on it. And if you look at the figures down at the very bottom there, you can see total input cost for winter wheat is at about €1,700 a tonne. Where you reduce down your inputs, be it your fertiliser or your fungicides, you can reduce that down to somewhere in the region of about 1,500. Depends on each situation, and maybe this is a case here where maybe if somebody has liquid nitrogen and they're playing liquid nitrogen, they can target that even better. So you get it down to there about €1,500 a hectare. And you look at spring barley, a 7.5 tonne crop of spring barley on average, which is a decent yield across an area of land. It's about 1,500 euros per hectare as well. And when you look at the bottom line then underneath that, you can see there cost per tonne at target yields of about 171 for a 10 tonne crop, 220 for that 7 tonne crop. Coincidentally enough, spring barley at 7.5 tonnes is 209. So when you look at the price of barley versus wheat at the moment, there's no benefit there. So I think even though you might think I'm going to grow a 3 tonne crop or a 7.5 tonne crop per hectare of spring barley, for all the work that you're putting in, chances are you may not make money on it. And I think that's fundamental to making the decision that you're going to make. The other option there that maybe was mentioned earlier on was, do I continue to sow winter wheat? And I think this is a common one that people often struggle with as well. And we're on the 1st of February tomorrow, so to me, the clock is really ticking now at this stage. And this is work that Richie Hackett would have done over a long time ago. You'll notice by the varieties there. But it's a good snapshot, and it's a good idea, or a good visual in terms of what to expect from these crops. And we know the pros and cons of sowing winter wheat in the spring, and in terms of how they perform and how they grow. They're actually quite slow to grow. But as you can see here, once you get past the middle of February, your chances of making decent yields are slipping badly. And once you get towards the tail end of February and into March, well, then it's really not a viable crop, really. So you need to bear that in mind. As I say, it's old data, but really it's still, to my mind, very viable data and a good indicator of where you should be. So finally, I'm going to leave with that, Siobhan. Take-home messages, really, you should be assessing your crops before committing to resow. And I think that's fundamental. Tim will be talking later on about, seed availability and things like that. So before you go and you start resowing, you need to make sure that, it's worth resowing and assess those crops critically. Be hard on them. There's little difference in financially, but there is extra work. So you have to look at that and all the other concerns about rotation, whether the crop fits in. And as I said before, I think I said this the last time I was talking about this, Sean, re-drill based on economics, not on aesthetics. So it doesn't matter how the field looks as long as it leaves money for you. So I'll leave it at that, if that's okay.
Important note to end on, Shay. Thanks very much. Dermot, we'll get you up on stage because we are a little over time. We want time for questions. If you want to look at the presentations as you're going along, scan that QR code on your badge. And as Shay said, get those cost and return booklets outside later on. On you go, Dermot.
Right, thanks, Siobhan. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about rotations, and I suppose the background to this is that we know from our research the value in rotations. I'll recap a small little bit about that from the work in Knockbeg, but also I think growers themselves now, particularly where we're talking about dealing with different crop establishment systems, they see the value of rotations in terms of maybe better methods of weed control and that, particularly with different crop establishment systems. So we need to watch our rotations. So in 2024, as far as possible, and some of the earlier farmers on the video clip spoke about this, Shay has effectively spoken about this as well, but we'd have to try and keep our rotation structure insofar as we can. That doesn't mean that you have to grow the exact same crops as before, but just to make sure that you'll have the entry for the next crops, or indeed don't mess up the entire rotation if you have a rotation. But it's also a time to maybe to think of adapting more break crops in rotations if they suit your system as well. So if you have winter crops that are not sown, if you have, for instance, cereals, winter wheat or winter barley, obviously, you're again talking about cereals in the same slot. And as Shay has dealt with, it's talking about maybe trying to get that winter wheat sown still. Spring wheat is obviously in scarce supply in terms of seed. It would be an option, but spring barley is probably the option for most, okay? If you didn't get your winter oats in, well, the obvious option then is probably spring oats. Same seed is going to do the situation. So if that's not in, that's the obvious choice. And oats is a very valuable break crop, a cereal break crop within the rotation there as well. If you didn't get your winter oilseed rape in, as one of the growers said in the video, that's a little bit more challenging because, you want to keep that slot maybe with, you have that there for a reason. So your options, if you haven't got spring beans already in the rotation, maybe is to use spring beans in that slot. Maybe you might think of spring oilseed rape, but it's certainly not a crop for everyone. But look, this is fairly a simple approach. There's no magical answers there, but certainly to try and keep the bones of the rotation more or less intact. So really what we're saying, I suppose, is to cost and value the rotation, not single crops. We know that a crop mix can give us benefits, and we've seen in our work in the past in Knockbeg that the yield benefit, and that mainly comes as a disease break. In one set of trials back a good few years ago, it was giving us about 11% boost to the following cereal crop, in this case a winter wheat. In our more recent work over a 7-year period, it was giving us a 19% boost to the following crop. Now that varied from year to year, but the average was 19% over that period. But break crops also give us different weed control advantages as well. The time of sowing of the different crops, the crop growth nature themselves means you might have a different impact on the weeds that are there in the crop, but you also get maybe to use different chemistry on those weed problems in the crop. There are machinery and labour benefits as well, that you can effectively spread your workload with different break crops. Nutrient efficiency is obvious. If you have legumes in the rotation, you can have a huge impact on how much nitrogen you use within that rotation, because you have 1 free year of nitrogen, right? 20% reduction if it's 1 in 5 years in that case. And you might have access to more markets. So we need to choose our crop mix though carefully, because the amount of break crops in the rotation, if you have a market for them, if your land is suitable for them, make an impact on profit. So what we have here is a slide showing the different margins, right, the crop margins, using Shay Phelan's 2024 crop costs and returns figures on this. But we're matching these with average yields, okay, so not target yields, but average yields over the last 7 years. And you can see the margins from the different crops. Oilseed rape here, okay, modest enough, but remember, it's going to bring benefits to the subsequent crop. Beans stand up very well at average yields, but the bit above the red bar is what the protein payment is actually contributing to. So remember that. But they do, of course, bring break crop benefits as well. And then the cereals follow that: winter barley, winter oats a bit higher, spring barley. And this is continuous winter wheat, or a second or third winter wheat crop. So it's bringing us a margin of about €400 per hectare. But in a break crop, after a break crop, our first wheat, we would say, if we assume a margin or yield benefit of 15%, it brings a margin for that individual crop increase of about 82%. Okay, so that's what the break crop preceding that crop of winter wheat brings you. Okay, so how do you do that? How do you maximize that within a rotation? Because obviously you only get that after a break crop. Well, this is kind of a simple, if you like, look at a rotation. So this is if you grow 5 continuous cereals, in this case spring barley. The yield, again, at today's prices, 2004 prices, an average yield, our margin is around the €400 per hectare, and this red bar here is that average margin. But then if you have a mix of break crops, a first wheat, starting here with that high margin we spoke about, followed by winter barley to give an entry to oilseed rape, lower margins here, but that oilseed rape gives us a big boost in the following wheat, okay? And in this case, we have either beans or oats, in this case, beans following that wheat. You mightn't want to mix beans and oilseed rape for weed control reasons, but beans in this case, back again to a high winter wheat yield or margin again. And if you average all those margins on this side of the graph here, you have this figure here, over €600 per hectare. So the difference between continuous spring barley and the rotation in this case is €200 per hectare. Okay, so that's how the rotation crops can be optimized, I suppose, to do that, provided you have markets and provided your ground is suitable for that rotation. If you'd like to look simply, the amount of break crops that are in a rotation make an impact on profit. With no break crop, we have the first green bar here. Again, looking at margin effects, add in 1 break crop in every 5 years, and it raises the margin here maybe to €475 per hectare. If you add in 1 or 2 break crops in 6, or 1 in 3, if you like, you're going to raise the margin more. Or the last one I showed you on the previous slide was 2 break crops in a 5-year rotation. So the amount of break crops that you have in there, the amount of first wheats you have in there makes an impact on your overall margin. Okay. Second last slide, this is really just to show that I've spoken a little bit, I suppose, about break crops and margins, mentioned weeds. The other thing is in terms of machinery work. And what we're showing here, I suppose, is how the distribution of working days might be impacted by crop choice, right? So what we have on the bottom line here is a harvest period from July to September, okay? And if we're growing kind of traditional cereal crops, maybe like winter barley and like spring barley here, you might want to harvest your winter barley in a work window towards the second half of July of about 11 days, right? You might want to harvest, ideally, your spring barley in a work window in the middle of August there of about 14 days. If by choice of other crops, if you add winter oilseed rape instead of some of these crops, obviously the winter wheat would compete here with the winter barley. If you bring in some oilseed rape there, yes, you're clashing a bit with the winter barley harvest. You might ideally want to cut your winter oilseed rape over an 8-year period. It overlaps a bit with the winter barley, but not completely, because it tends to be a little bit later harvesting. If it's beans that you add, and you hadn't been growing beans before, okay, there's a 16-day period. You're not going to get all 16 days, right? You're only going to get a few days maybe to harvest. But at least your harvest window is outside of the others. So what this means is that by, careful choice of rotation crops, it mightn't be the main factor, but you can extend your harvest windows, you can extend your sown windows, and effectively that means less demand on labour and probably lower machinery costs ultimately, because you get more efficient use out of the capacity that you have. So finally, I would say that rotations should always be considered, and I suppose this year what you're trying to do is make sure you don't mess up for future years in that. But the big point really is to you need to value your rotation benefits very carefully. In the short term, that's looking at yield and profit, like the first bar charts that I showed you. But in the long term, you need to look at a sustainability factor, and particularly in terms of weeds and some of the challenges that we're seeing now with grass weeds, with herbicide resistance, and particularly where we're adopting different crop establishment systems, the use of rotations is hugely important in there, and as a part of a suite of measures under integrated weeds management. And just to say thanks to Martin Welch and Frank Ryan for the work they do out in the Knockbeg rotations and systems trial, which provided some of the data here. Thank you.
Much, Dermot. Dermot, you're going to join us here, and Shay Phelan is going to come up. Tom Short, Wicklow farmer, and Tim O'Donovan from the Irish Seed Trade Association are all going to join us now for the panel discussion. The Slido questions are going to come up in a minute, and as you think of them, put them in. Shay, I'm going to start with you. Just one that comes to my own head, because I'm looking at pictures there of Tom Nolan's farm and that aerial shot, and there's bare patches everywhere in that winter barley, and you're talking about even plant counts, low even plant counts. But what's Tom meant to do with that field? And how will he be inspected as well if he doesn't plant them? Like, obviously there's issues there around inspection, but it's not economical to plant those areas. Yeah,
and I think I have huge sympathy for people in that situation, Siobhan, because it really is a difficult decision to make. I mean, there's areas there that are not going to yield. Is there enough of them within the field to actually go and re-drill? Because bear in mind, in that field there we saw in Tom Nolan's, if you go and re-drill some of those areas, you're going to take out probably other areas which probably are viable.
Yeah.
So that's an extra cost. So it's one of those kind of areas you kind of have to say, well, listen, yeah, I think I'll probably be wise to stick with that for the year. How the department deal with it will come down to how bare that is and how it looks on maps, I presume. It will be a pain for a lot of advisors and a lot of farmers that some of those areas will be fallow, and they'll probably have to mark them where there's nothing growing in them on the BIS application this year. So that will add extra work as well.
Yeah, and I just noticed they are the questions that are coming in on it. So people asking, should those areas be separated for BIS, and will they cause problems later and delay payment?
If they're marked out as fallow on the BIS maps and the applications, I can't see why they would delay payment. It's just a second crop within that field. Now, maybe given the year that's in it, maybe there's some flexibility within the system to maybe call it all an entire crop of winter wheat. I don't know. Maybe it'll come down to each individual situation, I'd imagine, because like the field we saw there in Tom's in Wexford, I mean, there were strips in that field that were low plant counts and some gone, but I know certainly of other fields where there's whole fields that are completely gone. So it's going to come down to each individual situation, and unfortunately.
Yeah, and someone asking there about the cost of the seed and what is the threshold for resowing patches with low plant count. So you've given them
I've shown a graph there, so or a table there, so I think people should really stick to those,
Yeah. Tom, you said you have 55% of your winter area not planted. What do you think you're going to plant now in that area? I know you grow beans. Will you increase that area? Maybe you'll grow a bit of forage. What's the plan?
Yeah, but the plan at the minute. The plan at the minute is, beans, an increased area of beans, and also an increased area of malting barley. Not ideal, because like malting barley, It has a small window of harvest. When it's ready, it needs to be got into a trailer in a way as quick as so. It's putting a lot of pressure on the system. It's putting a lot of risk in, and also for next year. Where we should have had more oilseed rape winter barley for next year's oilseed rape, that isn't going to happen. So it is going to have a knock-on effect. But we have to deal with where we are at the minute: increase in beans and an increase in malting barley.
Yeah, and good that you're able to increase your malting barley, because not everybody's going to be able to do that. Dermot, Tom said there his rotations are going to be affected now for a long time. Loads of people are facing this issue.
Yeah, and it's easy me, I suppose, say, look, mind your rotation, that's in that regard. But you do have to be, cognizant of the fact that the seed isn't available and it can't suddenly change. Like, obviously, if you didn't get a break crop in there of your choice, you'd like to have another break crop in there, be that maybe beans or be that, but you may have beans already in that rotation. So you really don't want to mess up that. Oats is always a useful crop in that area, but is the oat seed available? Is the market there available for that? So it is a challenge, but I think it is good to try and foresee where you're going to as far as you can in terms of your rotation and your fields. Yeah,
you talked about dividing out workload, Dermot, crops like spring oilseed rape, and that will come up now, and they will help divide out the workload, but they're risky crops to plant.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people who wouldn't go near spring oilseed rape. They're very variable. I would say dividing out the workload is a side benefit. I think the first thing you have to look at is the proper crop for your rotation, to look at how that's going to perform in your land and how that's going to impact on the rotation itself. I think you can certainly include machinery and workload as part of the benefits, but it's not going to override the other factors. And yes, people will be very nervous of spring oilseed rape.
Yeah. Tim, obviously seed is a massive issue, and Michael put up the figures. I'm sure there's people out there saying, actually, there's no shortage at all, it'll be grand. But Michael has put up the figures. The department are working with you on the figures. The seed shortage is real.
Absolutely, Siobhan. We concur in the trade with Michael's figures. We would have been tick-tacking with the Department of Agriculture, Teagasc, since kind of early November is when we started talking first. For the most part, I would say we have the same tons of spring barley in the country or coming into the country as what we had last year, as in 2023. There might be a small amount left to come in terms of maybe, I say we might get to 24,000 tonne of seed. Now, 23,000 tonne of seed is what we sold in 2023. We might get an extra few hundred to 1,000 tonne over that, but that's the limit of it. We're kind of gone to the far side of Europe at this stage.
So where are you getting the seed, Tim?
Sorry?
Where are you getting it? Poland is one.
Yeah, Poland, Italy, Spain, Czech Republic. The funny thing is, people would say, how bad can it be? I mean, the Danish would have rang me looking for seed in October. And in my career, 2001, 2013, 2020, we would have gone to Denmark to get seed for a situation like this. That option just wasn't available this year because Northern Europe, including ourselves, had what you'd call an abomination of a harvest. So that's the problem we're at. Now look, all of that seed that's coming in will be certified to European Union standards. If it's coming from the UK, then there's a different system, but we're used to dealing with that. We're dealing with trusted suppliers, our gold crop ourselves, and a little bit maybe with Drummond's coming in. And again, we'll be dealing with trusted suppliers that we have dealt with before as much as possible. I would encourage people, everything that Shay, Michael, Dermot said today is extraordinarily important advice for people to take home. Farmers are not on their own. Sit down with your advisor, your merchant advisor, whoever it is, and look at the rotation, and then decide where you're going to put that spring barley. The one thing we would say, Siobhan, if I have a second, is to be prudent with your spring barley seed. People often say, God, there's a few dry days come in February, I'll start sowing. Be very careful this year because there's no reserve if it goes wrong, whereas in previous years there was. And that's it. Like, does join in again?
There's a question just after coming in, Tim, so I'll stick with you. What are the standards for imported seed? Are there other weeds which growers should be worried about? And obviously people are very worried about grass weeds and everything, but are the standards high on this seed?
Yeah, I mean, it'll be certified to European Union standards. I mean, that's the standard that we've been importing it in for forever. I mean, after that, then we can request extra tests that can be done on grass weeds. But you're basically going to somebody now who has it in the shed, and on the other end of the phone is a man in Germany or a lady in Germany saying, "I'll take it if Tim O'Donovan doesn't want it." So that's what you're kind of faced with. So, you may or may not have the opportunity to do the extra tests, but where we can, they are being done. And as I said, we are dealing with trusted suppliers as much as we can in this.
And it does highlight the high standards of Irish seed as well. Dermot, you want to come in there?
Yeah, just to say, I mean, apart from obviously getting the seed from as high a standard as you can, if you do end up sowing the seed, to keep a record of those fields for the future, and really to put a lot of emphasis on, examining and walking those fields and hand roguing, not just this season, but maybe for future seasons, because you could, literally nip a problem in the bud there. Because we've seen that in the past. Shay would have plenty of experience of it, where there is a source that comes maybe through seed that is missed maybe for a year or two, and then is a problem.
That's super advice, Dermot, and very important. I just see a comment there: tree crop rule should be skipped for 24 due to difficulty in sowing and resowing, and I think that's the second of those comments to come in, and important to point that out. Shay, I'll point some questions to you. Some winter barley being sown, is this wise? And then the oats question, so when is the latest sowing date for true winter oat varieties? Is February sowing viable?
Yeah, again, good questions, Siobhan. Winter barley at this stage, to my mind, we're really, it's really high risk strategy now at this stage. And, in a lot of years, winter barley sown at normal times struggles to outcompete spring barley. So I know why people are looking at it. I would be very careful about, or very nervous about sowing it at this stage. I think it's probably getting too late at this stage. Now, other people might disagree, but to my mind, it's a high-risk strategy. In terms of oats, there isn't a lot of data out there in terms of oats, true winter oats this time of year, but I suppose most of the varieties are spring varieties. So you have Husky or Isabel, and they're perfectly fine. Again, for the true winter oat varieties, the sooner the better they get in the ground, I would imagine, so.
Tom, you want to come in there?
Thanks, Siobhan. I think look at the whole thing is so important when you look back at the last 2 years. The differential between the two, but the authorities and Teagasc have a huge role to play in this as well. That common sense prevails when it comes to the likes of the tree crop rule or land that doesn't have a crop. Like very few other sectors, the weather has such a massive bearing on us. And the best farmer in the world with the best machinery in the world still can't beat that weather that we've just had. So common sense, and I think we have to keep driving that message home that we can do what we can do. And there's rules there on covering cover crops and all. The pressure that puts on to the farmer in a season like this, it's totally unreasonable. And all you're doing is actually ticking a box. Like sowing a cover crop out late in or mid-September, that's an absolute waste of time and a waste of money. Common sense has to be prevailing.
Yeah, and bad for soil putting in those conditions. Tom, will you still try to drill winter wheat? Like there's probably not going to be very much opportunity with the weather we have at the minute. There's maybe a dry week coming, but is it still on your agenda?
No, we made a decision back in November. Look, we got the wheat sown after the break crops, so we actually have no winter wheat that we still want to sow, but we didn't get any winter barley or winter oats. I wouldn't sow at this stage, absolutely not. It's too high a risk because a bad crop, like when you look, I'm lucky enough we've small patches destroyed, but when you see the second farm there's huge decisions. I tell you, you're better with 100% or 85% of a loss. Well, then the decision is easy made. But when you have small patches and just the cost of production and the risk involved in going back in and resowing there, it's not for the faint-hearted. And I think when you see the extremes of weather that we have been getting, we bounce from drought to downpours on a monthly basis. You can't keep taking the risk, and I certainly wouldn't risk winter crops sown at this stage.
Okay. Tim, you might take that oilseed rape question. What threshold in terms of plants per metre squared would you suggest?
Yeah, just without walking it or seeing the root structure, I suppose 10 plants per square metre. I mean, it's really the root structure, Siobhan, is the most important thing, because that's what's going to keep it going when it runs into dry weather in the month of June. The second question above that about the Gareth seed, I mean, that was a variety that we had, and it was low germination. I can't remember, was there any vigor issues with it, but that was a question that came up. Just one other thing I just throw in, Siobhan. Look, we have limited data where we've drilled winter barley in February and March. It's done the same as the spring barley, the 2 years we've done it. It's limited, but it's there, and we are going to sow those trials as soon as we get a chance next week or the week after, and we've done that for a few years now. And just one other thing about the options for the resowing. I'm lucky enough, like when I'm sitting looking out at the weighbridge, and over a number of years, since 2016, our spring oilseed rape has actually been the least variable crop that growers are growing for us now. We produce seed for export. We do winter. We've 11 or 12 crops that we cross the weighbridge with, but actually spring oilseed rape is actually becoming one of the more predictable crops, for want of a better word, which is funny, but I wouldn't have said it if I was here in 2016 talking about it, but it is something. I wouldn't rule it out as an option, and there is seed available of that, okay?
Will there be information on those unknown spring barley varieties that are out there? Will people be given that?
Yeah, I mean, where possible, the first choice would be if we entered a variety in the Department of Agriculture trials 5, 6, 7 years ago and it didn't progress, so we'll have that information. Our own trial site, look, we take in the best part of 700, 800 varieties a year new, and only 10 or 12 of them get picked, so we have quite a bank of information on that. That'll be the second step. The third step then will be to try and get information on a variety that was grown in the maritime climate, so northern France, northern Germany, parts of the UK, Scotland, to try and get a yield that's comparable to Ireland. That's the key you're looking for. If you can get, 7, 8 tonnes to the hectare, that will give you an indication of straw strength, okay?
Yeah. Okay, and those the department need to act now. Those comments keep coming up to the top of the screen, presumably because people are liking them. So there's a message in that. The re-drilling options, Shay, pre and post herbicides.
Yeah, and I think that's something that people need to be aware of, Siobhan. Some crops did get a herbicide, not many, but some did get herbicides, and some of them were late on as well. So really, in those cases, you need to go back and look at the herbicide label and read on those. A lot of them will tell you it's 3 months before you can actually re-drill. Some of them are actually longer. So that's from time of application. So if you have somebody who's applied a herbicide in end of November, early December, when the weather allowed, you're really then looking at sometime in March before you can actually drill. So that kind of gives you a time frame, and you're probably looking at ripping that soil. It depends on your system as well. If you're in a min-till system or a direct drill system, you probably have to disturb that ground more rather than if you're plough-based system. So there are nuances in all the labels, so you need to go back and see what you used and then make a decision after that.
Okay. Advice around winter sowing. Dermot, I might take this one to you. We're being told to delay drilling, and for good reason, for grass weeds, for disease and everything else. But in Michael's results there, the people who sowed early, probably those direct drillers and minimum tillage, got on better with planting. So there's a fine balance, and we've had a bad 22 and 23 winter planting season now. So where's the balance like?
Yeah, it really is a fine balance and a very difficult one, because while there's no doubt earlier sowing avoids the risk of this, of some of the extremes of this, but not completely, but because this year a lot of early sowing still got a lot of weather, but at least you're in a time where you're going to have a longer period, maybe with better temperatures and that longer day length, so crops will tend to establish better. But the downside is the challenge for grass weeds in particular. So that's a huge problem, and I think we can't just maybe go to early sowing and see it as being the answer without considering that downside of grass weeds. But look, we have a workshop after, we might touch on some of that later, but it is a very, very difficult area.
Shay?
Yeah, no, it's just, I was going to say exactly similar to Dermot.
Okay.
We have to take all the IPM approaches to grass weeds. Early drilling is the anti-IPM measure, if you like. VJ and the team outside will show you some of the challenges that we're facing with resistance to herbicides. So again, we have to use all the tools that we possibly can to try and keep grass weeds at bay.
Okay, that's it for this session. Deirdre Doyle, you might make your way up on stage here. Deirdre's going to go through some research insights. And while Deirdre's coming up, I think we might give our panellists and the farmers who contributed and advisors a round of applause. Thank you.